Good evening, or good morning, wherever you look at this. About a man called Professor Brian Cox, who's a theoretical physicist. Now, anyone at all can be a theoretical physicist. All you've got to do is have a theory about physics, basically, and you can extrapolate it if you can with maths. You become what is called a scientist. Are theoretical physicists of any practical value? We're not quite sure. But the other night, he calls himself a scientist, and a lovely man. Brian Cox is a lovely man, and he makes a good presentation on television of lovely shows about nature, and he's very good at that. But he did something very odd the other night on TV in Australia on a show called Q&A, question answer sort of a show where the audience asks rather silly questions and meaningless ones mostly, because that's the only ones the ABC will allow through is meaningless questions, and the panel answers with meaningless answers usually, especially to make sure the audience isn't offended. You cannot say anything to the audience that may cause them to be angry or annoyed at you. Anyway, the other night, whilst he's here in Australia promoting science and saying on television, question everything, in a discussion about climate change with a man called Malcolm Roberts, Professor Cox lost his temper, thread, threw some papers at him for actually questioning science. So you have to ask yourself, there's Malcolm Roberts, an engineer or whatever it is, questioning science, and there's Brian Cox, a scientist, saying you can't question science. It's rather an odd thing. And then he is on TV, on stage, putting performance, promoting the idea of science, which of course in Australia is just a circus, because the last things in Australia they want are people who ask questions or are scientifically minded. That's the last they all leave. Anyone with a scientific mind gets out of here, because anyone caught with an ability to ask questions, well, you'll probably end up living on the street in Sydney. All the people living in Sydney are the geniuses who ask questions. If you ask questions, out the door you're sacked. How come the company went broke? How come the country went broke? How come we made this mistake? No, you'll be out. They're scientific questions no one can answer or wants to answer. But Brian Cox let the whole scientific world down the other day. I put a black mark against his name when he denied the right of another man to question the validity of climate science, a climate change theory, which is only a theory no one can prove beyond any doubt in any practical manner. See, science is not useful unless it can be utilized in a practical manner. Climate change, to know that it's changing, what practical use of that can people make but to try and prevent it? But when they're trying to prevent it, they're causing people to go broke and freeze to death, so that the result of climate change science and politicians or so-called experts, as Brian Cox said, leave it to the experts, the experts are causing people to freeze to death. So people are now affected already by climate, not by the climate changing, but by the politics. After advice by scientists like Brian Cox, the people are already affected by the climate, not by climate, but climate science. To try and stop people 50 years from now being affected by the climate. And they say the experts are in charge, and Brian Cox, what is his answer to the economic problem caused by politicians using a theory about climate change for financial reasons to interfere with the energy prices of countries such as Australia? when there is no reduction in the overall effects within the globe of the climate on planet Earth? Those are the questions that Malcolm Robert wants to ask, and those are the questions, because he's being caught up in the spin of this, Brian Cox cannot get into an answer, because he's now controlled by those people who pull the strings in this political game and circus about climate change. What about the economics, Brian Cox? Forget the science, we'll all agree that climate is changing. What are you going to do so that people don't end up impoverished because of idiots who say you can't ask questions about the science that is still yet a theory? And because you can't ask questions about the science, the theme is the intent of politics and the left and the universities who Brian Cox works for is to stop people asking questions about the economics. And that's what Brian Cox is involved with, whether he likes it or not. Thank you. This is E.T. I actually like science. I can't stand it being debased like it is by the people like Brian Cox, a theoretical physicist. Well, who can't have a theory on physics? Anyone can. Anyone at all can have a theory on physics. That's it. Up to all.